It's just a few short weeks before the Central Bank of Nigeria's revised cash withdrawal policy comes into force. But since the announcement of the policy change, there have been a number of reactions from across the formal, informal, business, and political spectrums. Under the revised limits, deposit money banks and other financial institutions are mandated to ensure that individuals withdraw no more than 100,000 Naira and corporate entities no more than 500,000 Naira per week. There is also a weekly limit on ATM withdrawals for individuals. Now, withdrawals above that amount will be subject to a 5% surcharge for individuals and a 10% flat fiat fee for corporates. But for a country where, like much of Africa, cash remains king, when it comes into effect on January the 9th, the new policy will likely change Nigerian life as we know it. Taiwo Oyedele, Fiscal Policy Partner and Africa Tax Leader at PwC, joins me now to look at the wider implications, including taxes, for the policy and what it could mean for Africa's most populous country. Taiwo, it's always a pleasure to have you on Business Edge. Thank you so much for joining me.
Thank you, Tolu.
So it's one thing we have to really set that it's very important to note that this will drastically change the cash withdrawal limits that have been in place previously before now. You're going from numbers that reach into 500,000 for individuals and millions of Naira for companies to 100,000 for individuals and some 500,000 for businesses. In terms of making that switch in just a few short weeks, how do you think it's going to affect businesses, particularly small and medium-sized businesses in the country?
Yeah, thank you very much. So it's an interesting conversation, I should say. The reality is that there's no country in the world where everything is cashless. So you really can't have a cashless economy. You can only talk about reducing the amount of cash forms of payment. It's important to say that in Nigeria, we have about 50 trillion Naira in terms of money in circulation, which is different from currency in circulation, which is a little over 3 trillion Naira. And that percentage is just around about 6%. While I was looking at the data around the world, for me, it was also interesting to find out that even in very developed countries, such as the United States, the UK, Canada, they still have a lot of currency in circulation. In fact, per capita, a lot more than what we have in Nigeria. So the 3 trillion plus, it translates to about 15,000 Naira per person in Nigeria, whereas in the US, that number is over $4,000. In the UK, it's over 1,500 pounds. I know that many of these countries, they have their monies all over the world, so that can account for why the ratios are so high. But if you take South Africa, for example, that amount is about 6 times more than what it is in Nigeria per person. So we have to recognize that you cannot have a cashless economy. Take, for example, you just imagine wanting to buy water in traffic. So how do you quickly give your card or do an electronic transfer? So you need money, you need cash to have an economy. So what the CBN is doing is also to be appreciated in terms of the objective. We may have, different views as to the approach and the timing, whether it should have been later, whether there should be more time. But in doing all of that, we have to do an impact assessment. So the impact assessment is not just focusing on the objective that government wants to accomplish. It's trying to say, what would this be? What would it mean? How would it impact large businesses, small businesses, households, individuals, even the financial system itself, including banks? So I do not get the comfort that that analysis has been properly done. We have the POS operators who are already, complaining because they're likely to be out of business. So I do think that a lot more impact assessment needs to be done. And it's also important and good to know that the central bank governor has said that this is not cast in stone, so they will be flexible as to the amount and maybe also the timing as well.
Okay, so we'll get into the POS operators because the numbers there are actually quite fascinating for this conversation and the tax implications coming up. But Taiwo, you mentioned, of course, looking around the world in terms of no one society becoming completely cashless as it may be. But a lot of people have also looked at the parallels between this policy from the CBN and what India tried to do in 2016, I believe it was, with the demonetization policy. And some have said that India eventually realized that it wasn't going to work. When we see sort of these parallel paths that Nigeria is treading from what India has already done, are there any lessons that we should take from that so that we can get over the humps and we can ease the inconvenience and pain that millions of Nigerians will likely feel on January the 9th when this kicks into place?
The answer is yes, Tolu. So what we can establish consistently, regardless of the type of policy, including the one on cashless economy or demonetization or whatever name or nomenclature you want to call it, is that there are two approaches generally. One approach is to use the carrot approach. You make the digital economy, cashless economy, digital payments so attractive and so simple and convenient that people want to do it by themselves, right? That would be an example of what you have in Kenya with the M-Pesa. So I went to Kenya, earlier this year. I wanted to buy a book by the roadside. And the woman said, give me M-Pesa. I was surprised. I had to go and do M-Pesa just to experience it. And you don't need a mobile phone. You just need a phone that can send a text. So that's one approach. Another approach is what India did, and that's also what Nigeria is doing. So punish people for not using electronic money transfers. So that's punishing them. So whenever you punish people, especially when you have not provided viable alternatives, you're going to, so a few years back, just last week myself, I had gone for a conference, spent the whole day talking, and I was so tired and hungry. On my way back to the office, I said, let me just stop by and have a meal at a restaurant. I made my order and it was time to pay, and they said, oh God, we're sorry. The POS is not working. So I had to now say, remove this meat, remove that one. I feel so uncomfortable, right? This is even me, and I have like 4 cards. They say it's not a matter of card, the POS is down. So what are you supposed to do in that situation? For another person, it could be medical care that you needed to pay for. So I think we have to, first and foremost, address the reason why people are not adopting it as much as we'd like to, because this policy was introduced in 2012. That's 10 years ago.
Yes.
So once we address those, provide the infrastructure, make sure it's working, give people the viable alternative before you start imposing sanctions and fines.
And as you share this POS story, I know that across Nigeria in the past 2 or 3 weeks, many of us have struggled to do online banking with many of the banks. There are just days where, in particular, no bank is simply working. And so many people wonder how deep or how penetrative the cashless policy has been if it's been over a decade and we're still having these issues. But Taiwo, you mentioned something about the carrot and the stick and sort of the India versus the Kenya approach. And let's look at a bit of the punitive approach that the CBN is putting in place here. And that's the 5% and the 10% surcharge, let's call it that people, individuals or companies could pay if they want to go over the limits. We're Nigerians, Taiwo, we know ourselves. There are a lot, maybe not everybody and not the majority, but there are a lot of Nigerians that will be willing to pay that 5% and that 10% surcharge to get the amounts they want. Do you think this is really enough to deter people from going over the limit?
Yeah, very interesting, question, Tolu. So one thing is you have to always bear in mind there's a lot of illicit money in Nigeria, maybe relatively more than almost any other country in the world. So people who, we've seen all manner of things on the internet, right? Of course, you don't know which one to believe, which one is validated, but you've seen money in SAPs that are spot because some people, of course, they're not money from hard work and salaries, right? So imagine someone who has stolen a lot of money, he will pay 5%, he will pay 10% because it wasn't his money in the first place. But imagine the hard-working person, to pay that 5% is going to be very difficult because they actually don't have it. For some people, that 5% is more than their margin. After paying so much for fuel and diesel, after paying so much for, transportation, salaries, regulatory costs, and all manner of expenses with rising inflation, right? So we may end up punishing people who are doing legitimate transactions and businesses. And the people we are trying to punish really don't care, and they'll pay those amounts and move on. So my view on this is you have to ensure that you have the right framework. In fact, another interesting story I should tell you is that my wife runs a small business, and as we were discussing this, I was putting my article together that I posted about the tax implication of this new policy. And she said to me that she went to Idumota, that's a market in Lagos, for our international audience, and wanted to pay. I said, well, I can't be carrying cash everywhere, so I need you guys to collect this money, using bank transfer. And then the seller just said, Mama Sikira calling the other person, say, Eya mini bank if you got transfer, which means, can you please lend me your bank account to take this transfer? Just imagine that, right? Of course, they trust themselves, but that's not what you expect under normal circumstances, that somebody will borrow someone else's bank account to get their own transfer. The reason why many of them are not within the financial system is not because they don't want to be. It is because it's too complicated. You fill all manners of forms, sign all manner of things. We should simplify this thing. If you can get a mobile phone which has your identification, that should be sufficient for you to open a bank account. The more you simplify the financial system, the more people embrace inclusion and use electronic money transfer rather than physical cash.
And there's a large number. Some estimates say it's about 42.5 million Nigerians. Others say it's over 50 million Nigerians that are still financially excluded and unbanked. So there's a large segment of the population that's still willing to be served this way. But Taiwo, let's go back to the tax obligations. You've written about this, and there's been a lot of conversation. In particular, you're saying that this new policy could actually trigger tax obligations for both individuals as well as companies. So explain that. What kind of scenario would it be for me to have to pay taxes because of a revised cash withdrawal policy that the CBN is introducing?
Indeed. So, because there's a lot of tax evasion in Nigeria, we have to say it as it is. And two, because we still have a lot of cash transactions. So when you combine those two, it's not surprising that the size of the informal sector is big, but also is the size of the black economy. So they're able to do all of those things and get away with them because they likely transact in cash. Now, if you make it more difficult for everyone to do cash transactions, of course, regardless of the implications like we have said, what you also see would happen is that more and more transactions get online. More and more transactions are within the financial system. And whatever you do online, transferring money, using payment cards and all of that can be tracked. In fact, it cannot be erased. It leaves an audit trail behind, which means the tax authorities then have the intelligence to know maybe you declared your income as 1 million naira in a year, but they can see all your expenses put together within the ecosystem that's 5 million. They're going to say to you, dear Tolu or dear Taiwo, your account is not adding up. So you then have to pay the additional tax. And it could be a small business owner. What that means is they then have, sight of what you're doing. And for some people, it could be you pay personal income tax. For some people, it could be a conversation around VAT if you're doing business. For some people, it could be a conversation around companies' income tax. For small businesses that are registered with the Corporate Affairs Commission. And it goes on and on like that. Actually, from this point of view, it's a good thing.
It's a good thing.
I do not know whether the central bank is carrying the fiscal authorities along, but this is what we expect should happen naturally. And therefore, it's important for everyone, individuals, households, small businesses, large businesses, to be mindful of this and try and do the right thing. We're not encouraging tax evasion. If they were invading before and they were not caught, it means that the time is up now. And you still wait to be caught because there'll be penalties and interest, and there could be prosecution as well. So do the right thing before it's too late.
So Taiwo, this could be a positive byproduct of this policy. Of course, we've had extensive conversation about widening the tax nets and, of course, increasing the tax revenue coming in. This could be a very good byproduct of this policy, would you say?
Yes, indeed. In fact, this should have been one of the primary objectives, that even when you don't agree with it, you can't come out to say it. Just imagine someone going to the media to say, well, why would I pay my tax and all of that? True. Of course, you can complain to say you don't see what government is doing with taxes, but if you take that aside, paying the right amount of tax based on the law is the right thing to do. The other thing I need to mention is that government, about 2 years ago had introduced exemption limits. So if your turnover is about 25 million naira or less, you don't have to pay VAT, you don't have to charge VAT on your goods and services, and you don't have to pay companies income tax if you register the company. And if you pay your employees 30,000 naira or less, they don't have to pay personal income tax. Now, what this has done is that government has created a buffer, a safe harbor, to say if you are really small, right, then you don't have to worry about taxes. Once you cross that threshold, then you need to start paying attention. Otherwise, you may get into big trouble. The other aspect of it that's important is there are lots of small businesses who don't understand these exemptions that are available to them. By the time they move more online in terms of payment system, you may find some unscrupulous elements within the government authorities and tax authorities taking advantage of them to pay the taxes that they have been by law exempted from paying. So that's why this education is important. And I think even government needs to do a lot of that as well.
Okay, so on a side note, you've mentioned twice the fact that there is a lot of illicit sort of money movements within Nigeria and stemming from Nigeria. We've heard a lot about grey listing and the potential for South Africa to have been grey listed in the past few weeks. Why has Nigeria never really been threatened with grey listing? Because this is a massive conversation as well. Illicit money laundering, money outflows as well from Nigeria into Nigeria through Nigeria. Why have we never sort of really faced maybe the kind of pressure other African countries have faced? As an aside.
Yeah, no, I think, we have been, I have to say we have been on this list before. We've been blacklisted, grey listed,
red listed
at some point. But I think we are not as financially embedded into the financial system of the global economy as much as, say, South Africa. So you normally expect there's more focus on countries like South Africa. Switzerland was a big deal. So Nigeria, in a way, it's not like the financial center for even Africa, but it's still important that we pay attention to those kind of things. It's about being transparent. Nobody says that you shouldn't have any illicit at all. That's not the benchmark. It's to have the system in place that makes sure that when you have those illicit, you make it difficult for those guys to be able to operate, because beyond issues we are talking about now around currency in circulation, they use those kind of money to fund terrorism. So this is to fund all manners of crime, including trafficking and all of that. So you don't want to support that as a government. So if you cooperate with the international community, provide the relevant framework and structure and systems in place to be able to disclose and punish when you find them. And I think the FCC, is one of the reasons why we're probably not on the list. But again, more still needs to be done.
All right, so let's go to the POS operators. Now, the national president of the Association of Mobile Money and Bank Agents in Nigeria said the country has over 1.4 million mobile money and banking agents. He says that in 2021, they did a cumulative of 6.4 trillion in terms of value on POS transactions and have exceeded 6.4 trillion within the first 9 months of this year. POS operators obviously fill a gap in Nigeria where more than 42%, maybe 42 million, 50 million, depending on who you ask, of Nigerian adults in rural areas lack basic banking services. Now, the association says they are asking for a review, not a reversal of the CBN's cash withdrawal policy. In terms of what they do, they obviously have filled a gap that exists in the Nigerian banking system. We've talked about the exclusion issue and the unbanked issue. But when you look at how this policy will affect them, even though the CBN says they can get licenses, we know that might involve maybe people's firstborn son and landed property and things like that. What would make sense for them and those they serve in how this policy can be structured to include them?
Yes. So this is where, inclusion, collaboration, engagement, impact assessment is so critical for government policies. So first, you need to have the evidence. So let your decisions be data-driven. And then engage. You have nothing to lose. It doesn't take your powers away as a CBN. If you call those POS operators and you have series of engagement with them, you call banks and talk to them, you call SMEs. So the more you engage, the more insights you get into your policy design, right? And then the implementation is likely to have, nobody says that you implement it and everything will just be perfect and nobody will be impacted. But we're saying, are there those we can avoid? If you're talking about 1 million plus POS operators, you're talking about 1 million households. So that should be important to anyone. So, and I personally think that the CBN could be less aggressive from reducing something was 500,000 before, and then you take it to 20,000 naira per day. That seems too drastic. You can phase it out. As you build on those infrastructure for people to use in electronic money transfer, then you continue to reduce the limits progressively over time. And then you find something in it for these POS operators. I have to say that there was a time when you have people doing recharge card, right? They have some big umbrellas and underneath they're selling cards. They've disappeared now because nobody buys physical cards anymore, right? But that was progressive. It wasn't sudden. So government can also find something in this new system for these guys. so that they continue to earn a living, while also helping using them as platform to promote this financial inclusion and cashless economy in a way that is not too drastic as to put them into poverty. We already have, 1.3 million people living in poverty. You don't want to add to that under any guises.
Taiwo, final before I let you go, we've talked about the potential for widening the tax nets and, of course, increasing tax generation. But on the other side is the direct and indirect impact that it may bring about with the POS operators, their families, and even those communities that they serve. If we're looking at this on a balance, how does it tip for you? Does it tip towards the CBN policy being in the right direction but needing some tweaks and balances, or is it good to go as it is?
No, I think it's a policy that is definitely in the right direction. I would question the timing. I would question the approach, because you need more engagement. You need more time. You don't need to hurry it. It's not like, because some people are bringing the political dimension to it, that this is all about vote buying before February. But I don't want to get into that. Whatever it is, let's have more engagement. Let's use more data. Let's do impact assessment. Let's limit the negative consequences for our citizens, especially those that have no control over this. They're the victim, right? So we should make sure that it's easier on them and see how we can help them get along and get, well in life with whatever little businesses they're doing. So it's in the right direction. We can, reconsider the timing and then do more engagement and impact assessments.
Leave it at that. We know the CBN governor has, or I guess management and higher ups of the CBN have had to go before the National Assembly to explain this policy. The House has asked that it be suspended for now, but it looks like the CBN might just attempt to push through with some revisals and some reviews of it. So we'll be following through with this conversation. Thank you so much, Taiwo, for your time.
Thank you, Tolu.
And it's a very interesting conversation, given that this is Africa's most populous nation as well as the largest economy, but there are trillions of Naira out of the banking system. And that's been a major issue for the Central Bank of Nigeria, as they say this policy, which also involves redesigning the Naira, which is now out in some ATMs across the country. We've started seeing people spend the Naira, but it's about fighting inflation as well as making sure that there's an ability to control currency in circulation. There are just a few short weeks for this policy to kick off. Will it kick off as announced, or between now and then, will the CBN make some amendments to ease things for Nigerians?